The morning after she heard Mama Uju's whisper through the door, Zara woke up before the sun with a stillness inside her that felt different from the stillness of defeat. It was the stillness of someone who has been warned, someone who now knows exactly what is coming and has decided not to pretend otherwise. She lay on her mat in the back room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the compound breathing around her, and she made herself a promise in the quiet dark before anyone else was awake. She was not going to wait for them to make the next move. She sat up and pulled her loom close and began to work. The pattern she had started 3 nights ago was growing into something she had never made before. It was telling a story without words the way the best weavings always did. The bird in the corner with its wings fully spread, the river running through the center in deep blue and silver. And at the heart of it those 2 joined hands, one large and one small, a mother and a daughter, woven so carefully into the design that you had to look twice before you saw them. She worked until the light changed from black to grey to the first thin gold of morning. Then she folded the cloth with great care, wrapped it in an old piece of cotton, and hid it at the very bottom of the wooden crate in the corner of the back room beneath her extra wrapper and her mother's old Bible. Nobody was going to touch this one. She heard the compound begin to wake around her, the house girl starting the fire in the kitchen, Mama Uju's voice giving instructions somewhere in the main part of the house, Nkechi's door opening and closing, the ordinary sounds of a household that had rearranged itself around an invasion and was now performing normalcy with the mechanical efficiency of people who had forgotten what genuine peace felt like. Zara tucked the crate firmly against the wall and went to start her chores. It was 3 days later that the village chief made his announcement. Zara heard it the way she heard most important things now, second-hand and late, through Kofi, who appeared at the back fence during the afternoon with his eyes wide and his words tumbling over each other in his urgency to get them out. He pressed his face through the gap between the slats and told her everything. The royal weaving competition, the prize of honor and riches, the presentation by the chief's son, the whole village buzzing with excitement from the market to the river. Zara listened to every word without expression. Then she said quietly, "I already know what Mama Uju is going to do." Kofi stopped talking. He looked at her carefully through the gap. "What do you mean?" Zara looked down at her hands. "She is going to enter Nkechi using my work." Kofi was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't have your work, you hid the new piece." "She doesn't need the new piece," Zara said. "She has been in this compound for 4 months, Kofi. She has seen everything I have made. She has been watching and waiting and storing information the way people like her do. All she needs is 1 or 2 of my older pieces to show the committee, and by the time anyone looks closely enough to ask questions it will be too late." Kofi stared at her. "Zara, we have to do something." "I know," she said simply, and went back inside. That night Zara lay awake and listened. She had started doing this deliberately, lying still on her mat with her ears open after the compound went quiet, tracking the movements and conversations happening in the parts of the house she was no longer welcome in. She had learned a great deal this way. She had learned that Mama Uju did not sleep until very late. She had learned that Nkechi came to her mother's room every night before bed, and they talked for a long time in low voices. She had learned that her father went to sleep early and heavily, and heard nothing. Tonight the voices were different, more urgent, more specific. She pressed herself against the thin wall that separated her room from the corridor, and held her breath. Mama Uju was speaking in a low, controlled voice. "I went to the chief's committee this afternoon. I registered Nkechi for the competition." A pause, then Nkechi's voice sharp and fast. "Mama, she doesn't know how to." "She doesn't need to know how," Mama Uju interrupted smoothly. "She needs to sit at the loom and look like she knows how. The committee has already seen the pieces I showed them. They were very impressed." "Whose pieces did you show them?" Nkechi asked, though from the tone of her voice she already knew the answer. A silence that confirmed everything. "Where did you get them from?" Nkechi pressed. "That back room is part of this house," Mama Uju said simply. "And everything in this house belongs to this family. We are her family, therefore everything belongs to us." Another silence, longer. Then Nkechi spoke again, quieter this time. "What about the competition itself? She will have to actually weave in front of everyone." "I have thought about that," Mama Uju said. "By the time the competition happens, Zara will not be in a position to interfere. I will make sure of it." Zara stood against the wall in the dark and felt the words land in her chest one by one like stones. She waited until the footsteps moved away down the corridor and the house was silent again. Then she went to the corner of the room and pulled the crate away from the wall and checked beneath her wrapper and her mother's Bible. The folded cloth was still there. She pressed it against her chest and stood in the dark for a long time. 2 days before the competition, Zara came back from fetching water to find the back room different. Not obviously different, not ransacked or torn apart, just slightly different in the way a room feels when someone has been through it carefully and put everything almost but not quite back in the exact position it was in before. The crate was pushed 2 inches further from the wall than she had left it. The wrapper on top was folded with a different crease. She reached inside immediately. Her hands searched through the layers fast and thorough and certain. The cloth was gone. She sat back on her heels and stared at the empty crate. The competition was in 2 days. Her finest work, the one that had her mother's bird and the village river, and those 2 joined hands woven into its heart, was now in Mama Uju's possession. She had 1 day left before the morning of the competition, when Mama Uju's plan would be complete, and Nkechi would walk into that chief's compound carrying Zara's entire gift in her hands like it belonged to her. Zara sat in the back room and looked at her loom. The loom looked back at her. She thought about everything she knew, about the way her hands moved in the dark without needing light, about every pattern she had ever made and the memory her fingers carried of how to make it. About her mother's voice telling her that every pattern was a prayer. About all the mornings she had woken before everyone else and poured herself into her work not because anyone told her to, but because it was the most honest thing she knew how to do. She could make it again. Not the same piece. She could never make the same piece twice. No weaving ever came out exactly the same as another. That was the nature of handwork. It was always alive and always different each time. But she could make something real. Something that came from her hands and her memory and the place inside her that Mama Uju had not managed to reach no matter how many rooms she rearranged. She pulled the loom close. She had 1 night. She worked through the entire night without stopping. No lamp, no light, just her fingers and the threads and the dark and her mother's voice somewhere beneath everything guiding her hands the way it always had. She did not feel the hours passing. She did not feel tired. She felt something that was almost anger but cleaner than anger, something that moved through her hands into the threads and became something extraordinary under her fingers in the darkness. When the grey light of early morning finally came through the small high window, she looked at what she had made. She sat completely still for a long time looking at it. It was better than the first one. She heard Kofi at the fence before she even reached it, already there in the early morning, already waiting, his small face pressed between the slats with an expression that told her he had not slept either. "Today is the day," he said. "I know," Zara replied. "Are you ready?" She looked down at the new cloth in her hands. Then she looked up at Kofi. Something had settled in her face overnight, something that had not been there before, a quiet certainty that sat in her eyes and did not flinch. "Go home and get some sleep, Kofi," she said. "I am not going anywhere," he replied immediately and completely unbothered. She almost smiled. That evening Mama Uju called Zara into the sitting room. She was seated in the carved chair with her hands folded in her lap, composed and pleasant, every inch the picture of a reasonable woman having a reasonable conversation. Nkechi sat nearby pretending to be interested in something outside the window. "Tomorrow is the competition," Mama Uju began warmly. "I want you to know that this family is very excited. We will all be going to support Nkechi. It is going to be a wonderful day for our household." Zara stood with her hands at her sides and her face completely still. "And I thought it would be best," Mama Uju continued, "if you stayed home tomorrow to look after the house. Someone responsible needs to be here. You understand how important that is." She held Zara's gaze with that patient, pleasant smile. Zara looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Mama Uju's smile flickered almost imperceptibly at the edges. Then Zara nodded once and said, "Yes, Ma," and walked back to the back room. That night Mama Uju locked the back room door from the outside. A new padlock, heavy, deliberate. The click of it closing was loud in the silent corridor and was meant to be heard. Zara sat on her mat and looked at the locked door. She looked at the small high window above her, too small and too high for a person to climb through. She looked at the loom standing in the corner with the new cloth folded beside it. Then she looked at the thin gap under the door. And she smiled. Because Mama Uju had made a very significant error. She had locked the door. But she had forgotten about Kofi. At exactly midnight, a small folded piece of paper appeared under the gap of the locked door, pushed through from the corridor outside. Zara picked it up and unfolded it in the darkness. She could not read it without light. She didn't need to. There was no writing on it, just a drawing, a small simple drawing of a key. She pressed the paper against her chest and closed her eyes. Tomorrow everything was going to change. She was sure of it. Outside the compound the village slept, unaware that in a small locked back room, a 14-year-old girl was sitting in the dark with a cloth in her hands, and a fire in her chest that no padlock in the world was ever going to be strong enough to put out. Tomorrow she was going to walk into that chief's compound. And she was going to make them all remember her name. Subscribe right now and hit the notification bell so you are the first to know when episode 3 drops. Comment below, do you think Kofi is going to come through in time? Like this video if you are Team Zara all the way. Share this with someone who needs to see what happens next.